Nice to meet you all. I'm Howard Anderson. I started teaching at Northwest in 1969. Can you believe that? That anybody could still be around? And what a great pleasure it's all been. I've done a number of things, worked with Acts and Trinity and so on and so on and so on, and just enjoy what we're going to do this morning and this whole kind of ministry. It's been beautiful. I have three kids, six grandkids. My son lives mostly in London, but right now he's in Mexico. One daughter lives in South Dakota, which is too far away and very cold, and the other lives not too far away from where we live in the South 30. So I'm glad for this time with all of you, and I hope I can be helpful to you in figuring out why you think the way you do, okay? So I'm not talking about what you think about, or when you think, or why you think, but how you think, yeah? And everybody has a way, and it's often a very predictable way, but you may not know it yourself. You know, your spouse may know you better than you know yourself in terms of how you think and what makes you go and so on. Here's a couple of quotes just to get our minds going, because we're in the business of interpreting, right? We're interpreting an ancient text, but into a modern or postmodern context, if you like. And one of the great British writers in the early 20th century said, you know, religious liberty might be supposed to mean that everybody's free to discuss religion. In practice, it means that hardly anybody's allowed to mention it. And that's fairly much like our world here. So it's a kind of a confused situation we have to deal with in this postmodern world. Similarly, these are days when the Christian is expected to praise everybody's creed except their own. You know, so the world was not always like this. Only 150 years ago, or maybe even 120 years ago, it was sort of unthinkable not to be a Christian in the Western world. You know, it's just assumed that everybody was on track, everybody went to church fairly regularly, and everybody was bought in. The whole idea of atheism and some people not being Christian was pretty foreign. Well, those days are gone. All of that's been swept away in the last 100 and some years. In 1925, for example, the United Church of Canada was formed. It was the United Church of Canada, right? And it has had many thousands of churches all across the country. Now they're closing one every week, and thankfully, all the properties, even for a small church, the properties are worth a few $1 million. So United Church can keep being a United Church without doing too much, and so on and so, you know. So much has been washed away. Out at UBC, for example, the two most wonderful buildings there were the library, big old stone building with massive study tables inside. Each table would weigh 1,000 or 2,000 pounds, I'm sure. You know, real classical stuff. And also the United Church College was built the same way, and it's a grand, big old building. It's totally abandoned now. There's nobody using it at all. It just sits there empty. It's an illustration of what's happened in the last 100 years or so. All our assumptions and our expectations and so on have been washed away. So it's a new world, and we got to figure it out, and we have to renew the way we're doing things, and so on and so on. So why do we say sojourner? Well, we're all making a journey, and we're stopping for a while at various places, right? We're spending time in this life on this planet, and but we're also perhaps moving from ministry to ministry and so on. And so we're stopping and we're starting and moving. And along the way, we need to investigate the landscape, right, to see what's there. And not, of course, the physical landscape so much, but the cultural landscape in which we're working and seeking to minister, yeah? And we are sojourners with a purpose and a mission, of course, so it's important that we get to know the cultural landscape. And what we're doing, right, as Christian ministers, is we're interpreters of the then and for the now. Yeah? And the then is really our Bible, which is, Abraham is 4,000 years ago, and he's not the beginning either. So that's a gigantic leap, and to think that we can do this at all, is quite preposterous in some ways. So we have to be good at this, smart about this, and get it figured out. And a big part of that is not just knowing the Bible, so to speak, but knowing us, or knowing our world, and knowing our culture, and so on. So how you see the world that you live in is radically important. And we're always making observations, and we're creating meaning, right? It's kind of a scientific approach. You observe, and then you try and figure out what it means. And people with a Christian worldview would be expected to see things differently, yes, from people without a Christian worldview. And I think it's very important to understand that meaning is something we make. It's not something we just pick up and observe. Like the meaning is not in the data. The meaning is what you make of the data, right? You create meaning. And so this is part of the job of interpretation as we sojourn in this crazy world. Just to give you some terms, you might think of what we're talking about as your creed or your dogma. And as I was suggesting earlier, everybody has some kind of a creed that they live by or think by. If you don't know what it is, ask your spouse, and she'll probably be able to tell you, or he'll be able to tell you, right? Because or your friends and so on. They know how you react, how you think, what you say, and so on. And it's very good for you to school yourself in who you are and how you think and why you think the way you do. Some other terms are, your perspective, or the paradigms in which you think, or the stance you take. Other terms are, your explanatory framework. Like, what's your framework? When you see something new happening out there, or read about something new, what's your framework for explaining that or interpreting that? Worldview is probably one of the most helpful words to use for this idea. It's your view of the world. Is it a scary place? Is it a crazy place? Is it a good place? Is it a fine place? Just to use a few terms to explain it. The philosophical word for all this is epistemology, okay? And of course it comes from two Greek words, like all great words. Episteme means the knowledge, and logos, of course, means word. So this is a word, this is the theory of knowledge, so to speak, that you have. And so what I'm doing with you is doing a very big picture type of thing, and others who will be speaking later will have some narrower focus on things. Okay, so what are some of the things that shape your worldview? Well, certainly family is one. The family you grew up in is a big factor in shaping your view of the world and how things are. Education, too, the education you get, or perhaps didn't get, is also a big factor in shaping your worldview. And then, of course, media and culture, especially popular culture, is coming at us by the ton all the time, right? It clearly shapes how we think about things and what we do about things. And then, of course, there's the civilizational aspect. If you are brought up in the Western world, you belong to Western civilization and you think that way. If you were brought up in Asia, and I use Asia, but there are many cultures in Asia, of course, and that will be very different by and large from Western civilization. If you're a native or indigenous, that'll be yet another civilizational factor that goes into who you are. I'm going to, in a few minutes, I'm going to ask us to discuss this, for you to describe some of the issues that have shaped you. Let me just give you some biblical examples of worldview issues. Okay, so take Job and his friends, for example. Job is one of the most powerful, amazing stories in the whole world of literature, as far as I'm concerned. And, Job's worldview was that if he was pious and he prayed a lot and offered sacrifices to God, he would be okay. Life would be fine for him and his family. And it was. Like, he had thousands of sheep and thousands of animals. He had an industrialized operation about 4,000 years ago. It's extremely impressive. He was a rich guy. And he did very well, and he was concerned to keep it that way. And so he made sure that he did a lot of praying and did a lot of sacrificing and going to church. And he one time he was concerned that his grown-up sons were partying a little much on the weekend or whatever it was, and so he prayed extra because of that. So everything worked. That was his view of the world, that if he did the right things in relation to God, God would look after him very well. And it worked beautifully until one day it didn't work. Yeah, it just took one piece of empirical evidence to challenge that whole mindset, that whole worldview. Okay, and that's really what the story of Job's all about. Okay, take the woman at the well, for example. The Samaritans say Mount Gerizim is where we're supposed to worship, and you Jews say Mount Jerusalem is where you're supposed to worship. How come we can't talk? You shouldn't be talking to me. We have different orientations, worldviews. We see things altogether differently, etc., right? And very interestingly, Jesus is able to bring that conversation around to something even deeper than a worldview, and that is, what do you need in life? She needed a better life, right? She'd been married half a dozen times, so on and so on. She needed a better life, and the conversation carried on from there. Let me skip down to the Sadducees. The Sadducees don't believe in resurrection. Okay. Well, if that's their worldview, that resurrection is impossible, then any evidence that there might be a resurrection, such as Jesus walking and meeting people and so on, is going to be discounted, right? Because there's no room in my worldview for something like that. So whatever the evidence is, I have to discount it. It's obvious. It can't be true because that's my mindset, my worldview. And then just to think of the meaning of repentance. It doesn't mean just to feel sorry for your sins and ask God forgiveness, but it means to change your mind, and not just your mind about specific things, but to renovate your mind, to think differently, and not to think the same. Yeah? So there are some examples from the Bible about worldview issues. So let's have a bit of discussion, and I'll just offer a couple of things myself, and then we'll ask you to respond. Uh, One thing about my family was that for the first 5 years, I understood that real Christians do not go to church. Yeah, if you're a real Christian, you would not go to church because that would be bad for you. And that seems a little weird, I suppose. But my parents immigrated from Denmark, and of course, Denmark has a state church, the Lutheran Church. And at the time they were immigrating, that church was totally corrupt, like and totally liberalized. And, the priests, the pastors didn't believe anything, and were spent their sermons criticizing biblical thought and so on and so on. So my mother's family actually had a Christian school in their home or in the community, and so on and so on. So they had to be. So it was not smart to go to church if you were a Christian, yeah, because that could hurt you. So so that meant I learned to do my own thinking, and so on and so on. And then by the time I was about 6 years old, we happened to move from Alberta to Ladner, and lo and behold, one of my brother's fellow students introduced us to a Baptist church, and they actually believed the Bible, and they took it seriously, blah, 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 and the rest is history, right? But my worldview, or my family influenced my worldview in that way. I'll just give you one more example. I went to UBC to do a Bachelor of Science degree, and we did 4 years of heavy-duty math and physics and so on and so on. And so that was all good. Before I was going to go further in math and physics, I decided I thought I should do something different for a year, just maybe literature, which I hated in high school, or psychology or something crazy, you know. So I wound up doing a year of theology at good old Northwest. And one of the first courses was on epistemology, or it was about how do you know anything? Like how do people figure things out? What makes something true, and so on and so on. And then I realized I'd done 4 years at a great school, and we never once talked about an issue like that. Never talked about the big issues, just math and physics. Yeah. So there's a couple of things that influence my worldview. So let's take a few minutes and hear it from you. Can you identify some things that made you who you are, and so on? So I'll start picking on people. Joel, right? Why don't you go ahead, Joel, for a minute or two?
Yeah, sure. I think growing up in my family, there's a couple of things that were usually prevalent. I think following the rules was like a big thing. So, and then some were written and some were unwritten, some were spoken, some were unspoken. Okay. But it was always really important to like follow the rules. Okay. And so I feel like for me, it was like if you follow the rules, it just opens up like more doors in life, and you just have more peace that way. Like things will go just better if you follow the rules. So for example, like if there's, I grew up in a Pentecostal church, and we had Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday midweek. And so if you go to everything, like that means like your faith is on the right track, and things are going well for you. So you got to keep plunking along. But I think the inadvertent kind of subconscious result of that was a bit of xenophobia, like fear of the other. Mm-hmm. So like if people are too weird or different from you, then don't like be careful about how much time you spend with them, or be careful about inviting them into your home, whatever, like, because they could really mess you up.
Yes. Okay. So
I think that's one thing about family. Education. I have like 2 degrees. I have like a arts degree with a major in second language teaching and a minor in theater.
Okay.
And I feel like if it wasn't for the minor in theater, then my worldview pretty much would have been all knowledge is like always in flux, but must be peer reviewed. Um,
I see. Okay.
you know what I mean? Anything we know could change next year.
Yeah.
But then because of my theater minor, I realized that like knowledge sometimes is not about necessarily like cracking the formula, but sometimes it's about like a communal agreement and expression.
Okay.
Like I kind of like learned the connection between art and in this case it was like theater, like an art form, and how we know things
Okay.
that are true to that art form. So that was like also kind of interesting.
Okay. Okay.
Is that enough? Is that good?
Yeah, that is good. That's really good. When you're talking about following the rules, I was gonna say, well, what would Job say? It works well until it doesn't work, right? And so on. So thank you for that. Let's get some folks on the screen. Aaron, for example, or anyone else who's ready.
Okay. I grew up in a small town in the north, so it was very like the rest of the world didn't really matter or seem real almost. You know, you'd see stuff on the news, but all I really knew was this small context. And I grew up in a very strict kind of church setting. So, like Joel was talking about the rules, and you made it to church every Sunday, or something was seriously wrong with you. And I grew up super strict. So, like, my mom and sister couldn't cut their hair and had to wear skirts, and I never was able to go to school dances or never learned how to swim when I was a kid because there was going to be girls there in bathing suits and like just all sorts of rules, right? Just rules. I lived in constant fear of going to hell, and I kind of felt like God was just like watching us, waiting to just step on us when we messed up. So that was how I grew up, and it's been a long journey to get to where I am.
Okay. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. And that's worldview, all right. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And your partner there, you want to take it next?
Yeah. So I didn't grow up in the church. I grew up in like a single child, single parent context. It was pretty rough, and like I mean obviously I have a whole life history, but one thing that kind of stuck out to me was by the time I was like 13, 14, 15, I was starting to understand how different like economic classes and social classes worked. And I knew I was in the lowest one in the community I was in, and that there was just striation of behaviors you could engage in, and things that you could do based on how much money your family had. And so for me and all the guys that I hung out with, by the time we were like 16 or 17, we already kind of figured that like people like us just don't succeed. Like we never get anywhere, and the whole, if you work really hard, you can make something of it. We just kind of looked at like our dads and our older brothers, and we're like, well, that's not really true. Like that's what they tell you on Disney. And so then the interesting thing is like by the age of like 21, 22, we kind of, I think, all figured that we'd be like dead or in jail, but we weren't. And we just hadn't made any good decisions about life. And then we're like, okay, no, we do have to figure out how to succeed and how to like make a living and how to plan for the future. And so we just got on that train really, really late. So that's like when I look at my, what set me into life, and what worldview really impacted the way that I planned for my future and who I would be. It was definitely that kind of low economic standing viewpoint.
Wow, you've explained it very well, man. And thanks for doing that. And you seem to have a good handle on, where you've come from and how you got to be who you are. Thank you. Jane and Rachel and others up there. Jane?
Yeah, so I'm originally from Kenya.
Okay.
My family immigrated to Canada in 2001.
Okay.
And so my upbringing was in the African context, and community was one of the major emphasis, like other people more important. In fact, there's a saying that you are because we are. So there was a lot of rules to how to behave, who you become, and character was really a huge part of how you showed up really in community. And my family, which was of an Anglican background, the faith community was very dominant in my upbringing, such that people within the church could actually discipline the kids. So you never know who is watching, when they're watching, and what they'll do when they find you doing the wrong thing. So there's that fear of being seen doing something wrong. And so my upbringing was, I was always very, very careful, very just wanting to please pretty much. And that was also coupled with, what was also celebrated within community was a strong work ethic and making the most of every opportunity. So laziness was really frowned upon, and people who seemed not to be educated or were not economically doing well, they were kind of looked down upon as incapable or needy. And so that had shaped a lot of the way that I even relate with people. But with the faith community, and it's taken me a while to realize that nobody's watching apart from God, and I don't need to feel the pressure of conforming to a community, but I need to conform to the image of Christ, and all the other things will kind of come together. So, yeah.
Wow, that's a beautiful explanation. Thank you. You said the community thing was you are because we are. Is that what you said?
That's correct.
That's kind of a neat statement, I think. You are because we are, and as a way of expressing community. Thank you for that. Of course, communities can be oppressive as well, but anyway, thank you. All right, let's go ahead, others. Rachel.
Yeah, for sure. So I would say that my worldview growing up, what I chose to cling to from my family background was that my grandparents had been missionaries in Indonesia. My mom had been a missionary kid, and that was something that I chose to grab onto as my worldview. There were other things obviously going on in life, but that was what I very much identified with and strove for. So through my teens and early 20s, priority for me was heading over to Africa for months, going down to Mexico. My plan was to go and open up an orphanage in Africa. Like, these are just the pipe dreams I had, the way I view the world, was worship God and call others to do the same. That was my kind of childhood worldview.
Okay.
And so I have been most of my life quite in the bubble of the church. And then some hard stuff in life happened, and Giselle, who's sitting there, and her daughter were actually a huge part of being my support network when life got really hard a few years ago, or 10 years ago. And now I find myself, the last 3 days, this is interesting, we're talking about worldview, because it's been front and center on my mind this week. I've been sitting in a room with like 20 other women with a women's shelter who are pretty big on feminism, and whatever you think that is. And we're discussing racism and intersectionalism, and like Elijah was discussing economics and how that impacts everyone's worldview. And I did find myself with a very different worldview than most of the women in the room. So I have been kind of assessing this the last 3 days of what is my worldview? Does it stand culturally, like on Christian culture in our church, or is it biblically derived, right? So I have been kind of really honing this through the last few days, which has been really interesting.
Good for you. Good for you. Yeah, thanks for explaining that so clearly, and your journey sounds very fascinating, and you're still on it, right? And we all are figuring it out. Thank you. All right. Again, I can't see.
Caitlin and Charlie.
Who's it?
Caitlin and Charlie.
Caitlin.
My worldview, I would say, comes from growing up. I grew up in Tawasin, which is a very affluent, historically primarily Caucasian neighborhood. There's more different people moving in all the time now. It's becoming more diverse, but generally speaking, it's affluent and Caucasian. And so we were not an affluent family. So we grew up, you know, kind of like Elijah, like not like in the lowest, but like definitely lower middle class. And I grew up in a family that is not Christian. So now my worldview from childhood does not look anything like it does now, because of the fact that, you know, when I was a kid, it was, you know, life is what it is. There's kind of just, you know, kind of believed in a God, like there's something out there, because that's what my mom would say, but like not the God of the Bible. And so like almost relearning a whole worldview in my like mid-teens was hugely influential, and kind of growing, like going through public school, wrestling between Christianity and the world was definitely interesting and informative or formative.
Mhm. Okay, oh, that's great. There's another person with another experience and grappling with worldview. Thank you. And then to Charlie.
Um, yeah, so my upbringing, actually similar to Caitlin, I grew up in a very affluent community, but my parents didn't have a lot of money, and so kind of grew up with this view that I was always in debt. Like my parents, we had everything that we needed, but there was always that kind of grumbling of, oh, like I can't afford this, you know, for my parents, but yet they would still provide. And so there's like that guilt associated with receiving things. And it was almost like I need to pay them back. I need to pay people back, because even growing up, like the friends that I hung out with, like they've, you know, their parents have mansions and everything. We're going to all these cottages, so I had a really good childhood in that respect. But I always felt like this sense of indebtedness to them. Um, and so to add to that, my mom's Polish, my dad's like seventh generation Canadian, and the Polish side. Was raised Roman Catholic, so went to Catholic school and all that kind of stuff. And so I grew up believing in God, but not really having a personal relationship with Jesus, or even understanding, or even being encouraged to read the Bible myself. My dad was more agnostic, not really believing. And so um, I kind of had this mixed view of, oh, okay, there's God and there's these rules, but we were more nominal Catholics. So I was like, oh, here's these rules, but you know, they're not really that important, and we can go to church a couple times a year, and that's fine. And the rest we can kind of just do whatever the world's doing. And so that kind of led me, as part of my worldview, was developing. I had this hunger and thirst for finding the truth, and kind of almost when I was in my 20s developed my own theology of like, okay, this is what I think God is. And then I started reading a lot of like new age books without even recognizing what I was getting into, and you know, looking at Buddhism and all these different things, while the entire time thinking I was a Christian and believing in God, but not actually reading the Bible. And so my worldview really grew and developed, and this pursuit of truth, knowing the truth, obviously came to its conclusion when I accepted Jesus as, you know, the way, the truth, and the life, like the only way, and the answer to all of my questions. And that really changed everything for me. But yeah, but growing up, there was that yeah, this worldview of like, yeah, I'm in debt to people that I need to find a way to pay them back. And so even now, as I play out like where I'm at right now, it's this desire for me to like wanting to be productive and wanting to contribute. And if I'm not, then I feel like, oh, like I need to work to pay off this debt that I'll never be able to pay back. And that's, again, stuff that I work on in my own life, of course, and I bring that to the cross. But yeah, it's just that's kind of how I was formed. And of course, you know, working through letting go of some of those uh, pieces of my worldview that are no longer healthy or helpful. So.
Mm. Wow. Nicely explained, Charlie. Thanks so much. That's everybody, right? Yeah, thanks everybody. That I feel good about what you're saying, in the sense that you seem to have a pretty good handle on what's made you who you are, at least in terms of your family contribution. Some of you mentioned the educational side as well, but that's really good. If you have a good understanding of what made you who you are, and where you are on the ongoing journey, and so on and so on, and how you might be different from the world around you and other people, and so on. this is vital, I think, to have this kind of self-understanding and how it relates to the bigger, wider world. Yeah. All right. So we said we're saying that factors that influence the formation of your worldview are such things as family, which you've talked about largely, education, media and popular culture, and then of course the civilizational factors. And so I want to get into the civilizational factors now, okay, for the next section of what we're doing. Just to highlight some of that, I think is very, very critical. And Western civilization was formed in a certain way and for certain reasons. And I think it's very helpful to understand what those factors are. And it'll help us in our articulating our message to the outside world, yeah, and interpreting the scriptures. So there are, in my view, and I think there'll be general agreement on this, there are three great strands of Western civilization, right? There's the Hebrew Jewish strand, there's the Greek strand, and there's the Roman strand, yeah? And this was all started to be put together for Christianity, so to speak, of course, in the very first century. I just want to make it clear, though, that when I say Hebrew and Greek, I'm not thinking of the languages themselves. I'm thinking of ways of thinking. In other words, the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, of course, but and the New Testament is written in Greek. But they're still they're both Jewish in their thinking. Okay. So I just like to go over these three strands with you. I think it's helpful to understand these, and it helps us understand what Western civilization is about. And we're all living in the West now, at least. We were born in various places, but we're living in the West now. It's helpful to understand this, I think. So let's take a look at, let's try to characterize a Greek worldview. Okay, and of course we're generalizing, but I would say abstract thinking is the Greek worldview. They did a lot of things, built buildings, wonderful buildings, and everything else. But what they're really known for is abstract thinking. So it's theoretical, it's intellectual. We got all the great philosophers of the Western world are Greek, right? Plato, Aristotle, and a whole whack of others. And they're into formal logica. It should be just logic, sorry. Formal logic is a big thing with the Greeks, and we're going to talk a bit about that a bit later too. They're into mathematics, which is very formal and intellectual. We've got Euclidean geometry. You might remember some of that from high school, or maybe not. Pythagoras theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, and so on. These are profound findings and great thinking that's gone into this. There's lots of science being done back there. Archimedes, his law of buoyancy. Remember, he took a bath and figured out, well, there's a law about buoyancy, how much you are supported by how much you displace, and so on. Very, very clever, very smart stuff. And the big thing about Greek thinking is creating cohesive systems of thought. Okay? Creating cohesive systems of thought. And this is really where we get systematic theology from. I mean, we have a doctrine of God, a doctrine of the church, a doctrine of the Holy Spirit, and all the others, right? And we get the notion of putting things together this way. We get that from the Greeks, and this is okay up to a point. Let's say we started doing this because we were living among people who thought this way, so we had to respond to them and put our message in terms that they could understand. Yep. So, characterizing the Greek worldview, it's largely abstract thinking. And we value that a lot still in Western culture. Although in postmodern culture, you have to wonder. But in up to modern times, at least, we valued this very highly. Yeah. What about characterizing the Roman worldview? I would say it's about doing and making. Yeah, it's about doing stuff and making stuff. In other words, thinking for Romans is quite utilitarian. Like, what's it good for? Show me something that you can make out of this, or what'll it get us, or where will it get us to? So engineering and technology were big. Like lots of Roman buildings are still standing. Some Greek ones are too, of course. But you know, the Colosseum, you've got aqueducts that are still standing. You got roads all over Britain that are Roman roads, no less, from 2,000 years ago. You got stone fences in Britain that were built by the Romans. It's unbelievable. They discovered cement, and then out of that they invented concrete. One of the best building materials that you can get for all kinds of purposes. Yeah, they're very military and industrial. Talk about the military-industrial complex. Yeah, that was Rome, and they believed in peace, but it was an enforced peace, like shut up or we'll do it to you. And the Jews found out firsthand what that was like when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, AD 70, when Masada, the Jews hung out there until the Romans took them down. The Romans, you could do anything you wanted as long as you didn't disturb the peace, and it didn't take a lot to disturb the peace at times. They had very effective political and social administration. After all, their empire. Think about this: in the first few centuries, they had an empire that went all the way from Spain to India. It's an enormous chunk of the world, and all the way from Britain, no less, to North Africa, no less. That's a humongous amount of territory. I don't. Well, you could argue the British Empire was that big, but this is unbelievable. And to keep a control on that and to make it happen, it's just an unbelievable achievement. So doing and making is what they're all about. So they have a very hard edge to them. There's nothing too soft about them, and they had violent sports, as you know, like in the Colosseum. You'd have human beings fighting with tigers and so on and so on and so on. Violent sports. We have quite a lot of that. We've inherited quite a bit of that interest, it seems, from the Romans, I would say. And of course, we know their methods of execution. One of them was crucifixion, of course. Just nail the guy to a tree. They nail the guy to a cross and let the rest happen. Yep, this is Rome. And it's largely about doing and making. So, of course, we have a lot of that in our Western world now. We're quite utilitarian. Like, if it doesn't work, who needs it? Throw it away. Let's get something that works. And if it works, that's all we need. Like, we don't care about the morality of it or the other social consequences or whatever. Oftentimes, if it works, we'll take it. Yeah. And so on and so on. So then let's get to the characterizing the Hebrew or the Jewish worldview, the third of those strands that come together to make Western civilization. And I would call this acting and being. So it connects a bit with the Roman thing, interestingly. But for Abraham, for example, who's the great exemplar of our faith, right? He went out not knowing where he went. Yeah? So for him, it was not a theoretical abstraction like it might be for the Greeks. he went out not knowing where he went. So it's experimental. The Jewish approach to things is experimental. Let's try this, and if it doesn't work, we'll thrash it out and try something else. We make things work by trying something, adjusting, trying again, and so on. That's the story of the Old Testament, right? The judges tried this, tried that. The kings tried this and that. Some of it worked, a lot of it didn't, and so on. And they tried to move on in that way. The Old Testament and the New Testament are very heavy on narrative, right? It's stories. What happened? What was going on? Give us an account of what happened. Yeah. So it's very much about acting. I don't mean acting in a theatrical sense. I mean making things happen. Yeah. And of course, there is a strong ethical dimension. Like there is accountability to God first and primary, and you don't see this in the Roman or the Greek thing in nearly that way. This is the first commandment. We owe allegiance to a powerful, almighty God. Yes? And there's also strong social responsibility. The second commandment. You have to love your neighbor, take care of your family, be good to other people, and so on and so on. So it's Jewish worldview is about how you should think, how you should behave, and how you should be. There's a strong moral imperative in all of this, which you don't see in quite the same way, or nearly the same way, I would say, in Greek and Roman cultures. So having said that, I do admit that there is some, sort of systematization in the Old Testament. So you have laws, right? Things to do and not to do. You have also Proverbs, for example, which are kind of efforts to systematize behavior. Like if you do this, this will happen. It's not just abstract thinking like it would be in a Greek culture. This is an effort to systematize behavior. So again, Hebrew is all about acting and moving and doing stuff. Ecclesiastes, remember, the Koheleth is trying to figure out what makes the world work, and he said, well, what if we do this? And he works it through. It doesn't seem to work. Well, what if we do this? Let's see if we can figure that out. No, that doesn't seem to work either. And none of his systematization efforts seem to work at all. And so in the end, he just says, the sum of it all is just fear God. That's the beginning and end of everything. The prophecy and apocalyptic, of course, is what you could do to ensure the future, right? It's the future look at things. And then, of course, the poetry is generally about our experience. It's not about abstract thought. It's about our experience of life, yeah? So there are three, quite distinct strands of thinking and of culture. And these have all come together in some kind of way to make our Western worldview. We all three of these strands are wound together to give us our Western worldview. However, they don't all play an equal part by any means in what became the Western civilization. I would say that the biggest single influence of Western civilization is the Greek influence. In other words, abstract thinking and intellectual work. There's quite a bit of Roman pragmatism too. We care a lot about what works. Give us what works, for sure. And I have to say that there's not much, it seems to me, that's authentically biblical in Western civilization. Now that may seem strange because Western civilization is Christian after all for the first 1800 years or something like this, right? So how can that be? Well, I think what made it that way was that in the first century, Christians were bumping up against the Gnostics and the Manichaeans and other Greek philosophical ideas, and say the Gnostics, for example, felt that spirit is good, body is bad, just to put it very briefly. So this means we got a lot of trouble with the incarnation. Then, if spirit is good and body's bad, how do you make that work? What's the Christian answer to that? So that's where the early theologians had to come in and work this out, and they had to use Greek terms because that was what was kind of predominating then. So we, through the centuries, through medieval times and so on, Christians have spent a lot of time creating cohesive theological systems, right? I mean, if you look at Thomas Aquinas and so many of the great theologians of the first 1500 years or so, they're working out systems of theology, systems of thinking that put together Christology, pneumatology, theology, ecclesiology, and so on. And so we have creeds, we have statements of faith. Yes, and I don't think it's saying too much to say that the definition of faith has changed from certainly from Abraham to modern days. In other words, the definition of faith for Abraham was you go out, you have a vision from God, and you pursue it, not knowing everything you'd like to know. But you adjust as you go along. You keep looking, you keep pursuing it, and so on, and you adjust to the reality on the ground. Whereas most theological thinking over the centuries in the Western world has been statements of faith. So now faith can mean a statement of faith, like it's stuff that you agree to. Faith is what you assent to, right? Or something you sign off on. That's a very different thing from a truly biblical worldview about faith. Yeah? And so this has not worked altogether well, especially in the last 100 or 150 years or so. We held it together rather well for about 1,500 years. By the time we got to Constantine, about 330 A.D. or so, we had figured out, how to deal with the Greek world and what Christian thinking should be like, and that served us well for the next 1,500 years. And it's partly because the church and the state were the same thing. The church gave authority to the state, and the state gave power to the church. So, those two things worked just like that until Martin Luther started questioning all this stuff, and then it started falling apart. So, so what we've seen more latterly is just incredible failures of evangelicalism, evangelical preachers and so on in the 20th and 21st century, and so on. I would say also one other thing we got from all of that is individualism, like especially from the Greeks, because you don't think as a group. Philosophers there are groups of philosophers, but philosophers think independently as individuals, right? And that's what matters a great deal. So those are strands that have come together to create our Western worldview. Have you got some questions about that at all, or anything you want to comment on or say?
feel like the Western worldview affects our approach of Scripture? Like, how does it limit our approach of Scripture?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is absolutely. It affects our approach to scripture, excuse me, radically. And like Abraham, who's the father of faith, after all, he wouldn't recognize anything about modern Christianity, hardly, right? I mean, he didn't sign off on a statement of faith. He didn't read a theology book and so on. That's a Greek way of doing stuff. The Jewish way is to have a vision from God. How do you get it and so on is a thing, and pursue it vigorously, you know, and make adjustments as you go, and follow God. It's about acting. I teach some statistics over at the university, and we can kind of make a parallel statement there that faith is acting on sufficient evidence towards a goal or a vision, right? So it is not blind faith. Abram was not blind, but he couldn't see everything. And he came out of Ur of the Chaldees, which is a city that has been excavated, and the foundations, being on the Euphrates River, were particularly bad. They were always having to renew the foundations. So what Abram saw was a city built by God that has foundations, right? So, and that's what he pursued for all of his life, yeah? That's what he's famous for. And that is, he's the father of faith. And so you have to wonder whether our Western way of doing things has served us well for 1,800 years, but things are changing, right? A lot of stuff has been totally swept away, and it's incredible how rapidly some of this has happened, and we're in a new world with new world views, and so on and so on. So I feel quite hopeful, as a matter of fact, because perhaps it was time to discard some of that old stuff and get onto something more real. I honestly think it is. And if we can all think this way or get onto this, we have a chance of making a significant difference in our world, I would say.
Can I just ask, so also there's such a thing as historical theology where there's continued revelation, which definitely we see from old to new. So how do you tie that in? Yes, God gave us more than what Abraham ever knew.
Yeah.
And yet still understand that we are now not in the world of Greek thought.
Yes.
But yet we still know way more because of Jesus' revelation than what Abraham knew himself. So how do you tie that concept together?
Yes, I was picking on systematic theology because that's getting things into a box and just keeping it there, right? But there are other ways of doing theology, such as historical, or we say biblical theology. Like let's work it through in a historical way and see how things are developing all the way through, and that needs to have a lot more life to it, and that needs to be more people need to get onto that, and we need to not be too influenced by Greek and Roman, right? We need to stay with the biblical message much more than we have been, I think. At the same time, you have to forgive, probably that's not quite the right word, but our early theologians were doing pretty much the right thing because they were trying to make it understandable to Greeks. Okay, that's an honorable thing to do. Our job is to make it understandable to whoever they are out there. They're not quite Greeks, they're postmodern, and they're a whole bunch of things, and it's very, very complex. But I think it's a great time to be alive and to be doing what you guys are doing, because we need to renew Christianity and get a whole new and more authentic, more authentic to the biblical account, I would say, than we have so far. And I think it can be done. Yeah. Any other questions? All right. Do we need a break or
We have a planned break at 10 o'clock.
Okay, well, 10 o'clock. Yeah, okay. So, everybody cool so far? Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Here we have these worldviews. What happens when worldviews grow old? Yeah, which they do, right? And the Western worldview, Greek worldview, is pretty old by now, 2,000 years. Not many things last that long. The story of Western civilization, Western Christianity, is quite remarkable. It really is an amazing story. I don't think there's anything on the planet that has lasted for as long as Western civilization and Western Christianity, right? The Chinese civilizations lasted for a few hundred years, and Machu Picchu and the Indian civilizations, North America, lasted for a few hundred years, but not many things have lasted for as long as Western civilization, Western Christianity. So, what happens when things grow old? Well, I can tell you from experience. You fossilize, you stultify, you harden, you suffocate, they crumble under your own weight. Yeah, and I think this is because human beings have this penchant for greater certainty. We don't like to live with uncertainty, even though that's exactly what Abraham did so well. Yeah, he went out not knowing where he went. That would never fly in a Greek context. We seem to need security and certainty and so on. We'd like to know the future, but this then drives out creativity and spontaneity and risk taking and faith and spirit, right? So. I think that's exactly where we're at in the Western world. Now we've got this thing that's ossifying, crumbling, coming apart some, and this will when it comes apart, when it keeps coming apart, it'll give us opportunities for creativity, spontaneity, risk-taking, and so on. And it already is. Like postmodernism is an illustration of that. Everybody's experimenting with absolutely everything, right? We redefined who human beings are. We've defined sexuality, redefined absolutely everything. We got to try and line some of this stuff in a smart way. And this is going to take a lot of smart thinking and smart ministry and so on. Let me just illustrate what happens to worldviews when they grow old. So take the Jewish worldview, for example. When it grew old, it was growing old by the time Jesus came along, right? And he complained about it as well, right? He said, you're all hung up on the letter and there's no spirit left. You're ossified. You've gone crazy on some things, and you're way too tight on stuff. And we have in the first 2 centuries before Christ and the first couple after, we have the production of something called the Mishnah. I have it right here. It's about 800 pages, and it's basically case law, case Jewish law. So Rabbi so-and-so, when he was determining this, he said this and that and the other. Rabbi so-and-so, somebody else said, no, it's this way. This is how I determine it, and so on. And there's a whole section here on the Sabbath, for example. So, the law about the Sabbath is you shouldn't be going out or going in on the Sabbath. Yeah? But what does that mean? Let's say you're at the shopkeeper's place and you need to buy some pretzels or whatever. Can you go into the store? No, well, no, you can't. Can he come out of the store? No, he can't. But let's resolve it by saying, well, if you reach in part way and he reaches out part way, that's going to be okay. Okay? So there's 800 pages of that here. Okay? And, and this is what happens when worldviews grow old and crazy, right? Yeah. Jesus was onto that too. In the Roman world, when that it went on, not for several thousand years, but for a few hundred, and it got more and more troublesome to rule a whole big empire like this. So everything got hardened up big time. Hardening of military rule. Everything is by force, and including peace. We get peace by force. We insist that we have peace, and only the outcome matters. So how you get there doesn't matter much at all. This is what happens, or what did happen. What has happened in the Christian Greek worldview? Well, I think again, this systematizing tendency has turned in on itself. So it becomes a matter of the letter, not the spirit. So starting in let's say Germany in the 19th century, you've got all the scholars going hard on the details of the biblical text, figuring out what's behind it, how many different documents have come together for this and that and the other, and so on and so on. So it becomes about the letter, not the spirit. And by the time you get into the Middle Ages, you've got, well, how many angels could actually dance on the head of a pin? That's an interesting question, isn't it? And we should try and get an answer to it, don't you think? And so, as I was saying before, I think what has happened over those 2,000 years is there's a change in the definition of faith. In Abraham's time, it was acting on evidence towards a God-inspired vision, right? It was not without evidence. He didn't know everything he would have liked to know, but he adjusted to the evidence on the ground as he moved along. Whereas now, in a fully developed Christendom, it's about assenting to creeds and statements of faith and so on, which is a very Greek way of thinking about things. So it has become about the truth and not a whole lot about the life or the way. It's become largely about the truth, which is important, but the way, evangelicals have kind of lost their way. There's, as we said, there's some big-time examples of big failures, Mars Hill and all kinds of others, just spectacular failures of character and behavior. It's unbelievable. But it's partly because we decided that, the Western world decided that, truth in a very narrowly defined thing was all that mattered. So you could be a rascal as long as you were saying the truth, quote unquote, you're okay. Yeah. All right. Any issues? Are you cool? All right. Here's a chance for us to discuss some stuff, and I just wanted to get you going on this, and just to try to show you that this whole business of formal logic and so on that the Western world has been so enamored with has its limits. So take a look at these two arguments here, okay? The first argument and the second argument. And you can tweak some of these. You can tweak this some, of course. But I'm just trying to illustrate the limits and the function of logic, okay? So consider the first one. The dead do not rise. Jesus was dead, therefore Jesus did not rise. Do you buy that as a logical argument?
Yeah.
Yeah, logical. Anybody feel it's not logical? Okay, let's go on to the second argument. The dead do rise. Jesus was dead, therefore Jesus did rise. Is that also logical? Yeah. Anybody dispute the logic of each of these arguments? Are you not going to say?
It's not necessarily so that Jesus did rise, even though the dead do rise, because he may not have been one of the ones who rose.
It could be, yes. So you can tweak this some so Jesus could rise. We might say, yeah. But so if each of these arguments is sort of equally logical, and yet they come up with a totally they come up with opposing conclusions, what does that mean, or how does that work, or what does it tell us?
What you start with matters.
Mm.
There are significant limitations on what logic from a human standpoint can actually tell you, right? Like when you move God off of the centerpiece of all existence and you put human logic there, you come to wrong conclusions because we're not equipped to know all things, right? So we have expectations of human logic that far exceed logic's capacity to actually produce.
Okay. Anybody else want to have a go at it?
Yeah, just I think one thing that just came up for me as we were looking at this is the fact that logic doesn't necessitate truth. Just because something's logical doesn't mean it's true.
And why is that? How can that be?
I guess part of that is because we only see a small scope, a small puzzle piece in the grand scheme of things. And we try and make our decisions based on the limited amount of information that we have. And so I guess the reason why not all logical things are true is because we actually don't know what we don't know, and we don't know the bigger picture that we're missing out on.
Okay. Somebody else want to have a go at it as well? Anybody else want to have a go at it?
Just, I don't know if this is even a cohesive thought, but within those two statements, the logic, whether or not those statements are logical or those formulas are logical, are tied to the initial statement and contained by the initial statement. So like saying the dead do rise and the dead don't rise, saying those two things together is illogical because you can't necessarily have both, or you shouldn't be able to in a logical situation. But separating those two statements and then having logic within the one and then a separate logic within the other, both can be logical. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this.
I think you're going on the right place. Yeah. So I think it's like Giselle said. The difference here is where you start, right? The first one starts with dead do not rise and gets a conclusion, a logical conclusion. The second one starts the dead do rise and gets to an equally logical conclusion. So where you start is what makes all the difference, right? And logic is only a way to get from one truth to another truth. It's not a way to find the first truth. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So defining the first truth, you can't get that by logic because it wouldn't be the first truth then. Truth is always the result of logic, which begins with some first truth. So where do you get the first truth then? Not from logic. It has to come from somewhere else. And the first truth is always an assumption. Now you can and should examine the assumption and test it in every way you can, but everybody who claims to be logical, it's all very good, and we claim that too, right? It's not the exclusive territory of science or anything else. Everybody wants to be logical, but the thing that makes the difference is where you start, right? Your starting assumption. And that says, among other things, that when we're dealing with the outside world and postmodernism and all the rest, that's where we should focus some attention. Like, well, where are you starting from? What are your assumptions? How do you know that to start with? Where are you coming from? Where are you getting this? Your first starting point and so on. Yeah.
Can I just
Yeah. Go ahead.
logic really defies logic. So when we're talking about death in the human realm, then what we're doing is using human reasoning. But when we're talking about God or the realm of the spirit, then there are things that are going to be in the mystery, and it's not going to be logical. Otherwise, our faith and the miracles that we read about in scripture would just seem like illogical fables and stories that are not founded on anything. So the foundation, which is faith realm, God, then leads us to believe in things that defies logic. I think I'm going in circles, but that's my answer for your question.
Okay. Um, yeah, maybe. I would say that everything Abraham did was quite logical. I would say, um, but I suppose it's not purely logical. It's very pragmatic as well. Thanks for putting it that way. And I want to get to that before we're done today, okay? Like, I'd like to just sort of outline a so-called scientific worldview and then outline a biblical worldview and make some comparisons there. So let's get there. Thanks for that. Anybody else want to say something? Okay, let's move on, and I'm going to skip over some of these next ones pretty quickly. I just want to say this, that in the first 4 centuries of Christianity, they were arguably the most successful Christianity has ever been, I would say. They literally took over the Roman world. By Constantine in 313, he converted to Christianity. His mother was a Christian, interestingly, and he issued the Edict of Milan, which said it's no longer illegal to be a Christian, and things went on from there. And what made those first 4 centuries successful, I think, were 2 things. One is that the lay people, the ordinary people, the church people, broke their backs looking after the poor and the sick and the ailing. I mean, there was a massive fulfillment of the second commandment there, loving your neighbor. They had plagues and everything else and all kinds of stuff and all kinds of persecution too. But, the ordinary people were exemplary in the way that they looked after other people. And it was very convincing to those around. There's something really special going on with these people. What is it? It's something about this person Jesus Christ. That's one thing that made it successful. The other thing is that the theologians of the church were smart enough to figure out how to deal with, various elements of Greek thinking and made a way for Christian thinking to to engage and to move forward and so on. And I think it's what's needed today. We need a whole, we need thousands of people who will love their neighbors, and we need lots of theologians and pastors who know how to articulate the message into this kind of a world. You know, and it's no easy task to figure it all out. But there's lots of opportunity because the thing that's out there is not one big massive thing. The thing that's out there is a whole bunch of broken up things, right? There's this ideology and that ideology and this and that and the other. It's tribalism all over again. And there's a chance, I think there's a marvelous chance for Christians to make their voice heard among the whole plethora of options that are there. I'm going to skip through this pretty fast now. I just wanted to say this, that we think of the Dark Ages as pretty dark, but every European country created a university around 1000, 1100, 1200. It's remarkable. And the Italian Renaissance, things started percolating and happening. It is possible to renew and for good things to happen. Again, I just want to keep going on this because what we've got now, I think a way to characterize what we've got now is we're in the process of replacing a Christian worldview by a scientific worldview. Now, when we had the Christian worldview, it's not as if every Christian knew everything that he ought to know or knew everything about everything. And it's not as if people who believe in science and quote, know that much about science either. But they're buying it because it's there. And the men in white coats and all that, make a convincing case, and they carry a lot of authority in our world. But of course, all of the early scientists were Christians. Everybody in the 15th century, 14th, and so on, was some kind of a Christian, right? To be not Christian was totally unthinkable. And not to be a theist was even more unthinkable. It's just part of the culture and so on and so on. And some modern scientists need to be sharply reminded of that. So let's just talk about this. What is science? Well, I consider it to be a rational explanation of physical phenomena. Okay, it's about the physical world. It's not about the metaphysical world. It's about what you can see, what's hard, what you can put your finger on, what you can knock about, what you can dissolve, dilute, attach, and so on. It's largely about the physical world, and we should keep scientists there. We shouldn't let scientists get too far out of their lane because they're nothing but trouble when they start speaking in other disciplines. And science is about the accumulation of knowledge, and that's it. Like we don't really care what happens with this knowledge or what's done with this knowledge. We just want to accumulate knowledge. And so whether you use it to make bombs or to make other things, strictly speaking, scientists don't care. We just want to accumulate knowledge about how the world works. It's also a method of investigation. I'll get to that in a minute. But speaking of starting assumptions, we looked at the logic there. What's the starting assumption of science? One starting assumption is that God is not acceptable as an explanation for anything, okay? For anything that we care about, that is physical phenomena. You can't say, I can't figure that out, God must have done it. That's totally taboo in science. God is not acceptable as an explanation for anything. So in that sense, it is atheistic. It is non-theistic. God is out of the picture in terms of any kind of explanation. Now, I'm not saying every scientist thinks this, but when he's doing his science, he's supposed to think this, okay? And also, a big thing about a starting assumption of science is that some things are impossible. We're prepared to say that. You know, it's quite a bold, shocking statement, really, isn't it? But we're prepared to say that some things are impossible, that they cannot happen. Wow, that's a huge starting statement, and that's where they're at. Let's talk about the scientific method. There's so much that's good about it. Be curious about the universe. Absolutely. Ask questions. Try to figure things out. If you haven't read Job 38 to 41 recently, you should, because this is all about the natural world and the wonder of it, okay? And so doing science and wondering about this amazing world we live in is totally good and justifiable and totally valued in the biblical account. It's what you do, what conclusions you come to, the better, of course. So science is curious about the universe. It systematizes observations of the physical phenomena that we're interested in, and it records the data, and so on and so on. And then it formulates an hypothesis or a possible explanation. And of course, because we're investigating natural things, this will be a natural or physical explanation. You can't have anything spooky about it. Here you have to be able to nail it all. And so be it. I'm happy for science to be that way. And we shouldn't let them out of that box. We should keep them in that box, because that's where they're good, you know, and that's where they can be most helpful. And then they test this hypothesis, this possible explanation, and they check its predictive value. Like if we tweak this thing this way again, will we get the same result the next time? And so on and so on. And you keep doing that. You keep iterating, and soon you've got a new hypothesis, or you can state a theory, like you say, well, this is how this thing works, okay? And this is a great thing. We should appreciate science very highly for what it does, I would say, but we shouldn't tolerate any interference from science into other realms of investigation, because they don't have the skills or the tools or the methods to do that, you know. And I just want to say, you know, science as a discipline is one thing. There are lots of Christians who do great science, but they when they're doing their science, they sort of have to avoid, you know, the theology of it, or they have to avoid making God the explanation of anything. I think it's valid and legitimate to do that, and they're certainly doing it. Okay, so what's a biblical worldview in comparison or in contrast, perhaps? Well, you know, there's Genesis 1:1 is the most fabulous statement in any piece of literature anywhere ever, I would say, because it states its starting assumption so baldly and clearly. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Could you ask for anything clearer than that as an opening statement for a long argument or for a long story of 1,000, 1,200 pages? This is a marvel and just a wonderful example of how every book should start. What's your starting assumption? Okay, and here it is, and just the very first verse. And of course, it's utterly theistic, right? God was there, and he did the whole thing. And this is totally different from the starting assumptions of science, you know. And because of that, like, nothing is impossible. It's just that way, folks. Nothing is impossible. You can't rule anything out. That's not to say that every crazy thing is likely to happen or probably going to happen. Not at all. It's just that you can't say anything is impossible. Okay, so that's a great starting assumption, and it makes all the difference, of course, in the world and everywhere else. Yeah. Um, so more on the biblical worldview. The universe has kind of a slant to it, right? Because God created mankind with a free will. Man mishandled that and challenged God's authority, and man wants to be independent and autonomous and so on. And so we have the fall, yeah, in Genesis 3. And so we now live with that human condition, right? That we're in a world that is conditioned in a certain way, and there's a downward pull and a downward trend, yes, and we call it sin, yes, and we call it temptation to sin, and so on. The scientists call it chaos or entropy or friction or inertia and even momentum. Like once you start something, it's hard to stop it, yeah? In statistics, you call it tendency or propensity or bias and so on. They're all referring to the same, downward pull, the drag there is on doing anything worthwhile and good, yeah? This is a biblical worldview, and it's if I may say, it's pretty darn realistic, yeah? So what we have in the biblical worldview is human beings pitched against the human condition, so to speak. This is our struggle. This is what we're dealing with all the time. Also, and this is something I think, the Greek worldview is kind of put to the side, but if you look at Abraham, God is in day-to-day human life. It's just remarkable. I've been reading it over and over again recently, and it's just the most natural thing for Abraham to be talking to God as he moves along, and for God to be talking to him and so on. It's kind of a symbiosis there. It's quite remarkable. And of course, God breaking through in dramatic ways from time to time, as we see throughout the biblical record, and so on. And there's two things that matter supremely in the biblical worldview, right? There's accountability to God. That's the first and great commandment. Without that, you've got nothing. Yeah, you certainly got nothing remotely like a biblical worldview. And then there's social responsibility. That is responsibility to other people. It can't be too individualistic. That's the second great commandment. Those are the two things that matter supremely. And you see that in the life of Abraham and others. And you see it in all of the accounts of the Old Testament, judges and kings and so on. You see it in the breaking of the commandments as much as you see it in the fulfillment of the commandments, of course. But it's all still there. Also, in a true Old Testament and New Testament reading, God is always available and always discernible and reachable if you work at it, and so on and so on, if you try, right? Like He's not as remote as one might think. And then this is pretty important, I think. Our view of man, the image of God is in man. It wasn't destroyed absolutely or entirely, and so however we might redefine what is a human life, what is gender, what is all the rest, you're not getting rid of the image of God quite that easily. All right. Any questions about that, or any issues about that? Biblical and scientific worldviews? As I say, I think what's happening right now, the grand sweep of things, is that the truly biblical worldview is being washed away, and it's being replaced by a so-called scientific worldview. And it's not that everybody's a great scientist now, and it's not that everybody was a great theologian then. It's just that these are the great movements that sweep across societies, and our society in particular right now.
Yeah. I would comment to that. I think what we saw in like the last, I don't know, 40, 50 years as, the quote unquote separation of church and state, the church had to stay in its lane, science had its role. And as more and more people moved away from a biblical worldview, we ended up looking to science to explain things that science never set out to explain, right? Like science can explain very well how billiard balls are going to react when you strike them with a pool cue. It can't tell you why you feel an emptiness in your heart when you look at the next 10 years of your life and the potential outcomes with your job. Yeah. Science can't, they'll try to get into the nitty gritty and say that, yeah, there's like biochemical reactions happening in your brain, but at the core of it, why? And it can't do that. And so we, instead of like socially, instead of doing a course correction and moving back to back to a biblical worldview, we started to say, well, maybe science, it can be leveraged in the direction of explaining things that are unique to me. And so I'm interested to see what you have to say about kind of how we got to the post, like, what do you think the linchpin was there that really got us on the journey to postmodernism?
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, good thoughts in science there, and I think you're right. Like, I don't know if you've read Steven Pinker. Have you by any chance?
I haven't read, but I've checked out a lot of his debates.
Okay.
I like and don't like Steven Pinker at the same time. I like his thoughts.
Yeah, he's a very, very smart guy. He's a Canadian who works at Harvard, but he's written a lot on all of this stuff, and he's pretty convinced that if we keep going on the neurological brain science and so on, we will figure everything out, and we won't need anything remotely like God and faith anymore. But I have serious doubts about whether that can ever happen, because it's not physical. Science people work on physical stuff, and they have no room for what's beyond physical, and so I can't see it working. Nonetheless, I'd love to see how far they get and what they can tell us and so on. It's all perfectly fine and good, but a way to think of this is to say we should have a theology of science, but there's no way we can have a science of theology. Okay. Like, there's no category that's bigger than theology. There can't be, right? And so everything has to fit inside theology, right? So there could be a theology of science, a theology of this, theology of that, and so on. And that's what we're looking for and waiting for. Okay, postmodernism. Yeah. How did we get there? Well, I think to answer your question partly. I think there is a certain element of society that's come to the conclusion that maybe even science is not going to be good enough, right? It's too restricting. There's no life in it. It doesn't explain everything we care about. What about love and all that? And scientific explanations are just not gonna cut it. So let's experiment with other things, yeah? And so let's redefine everything. It doesn't matter whether we can arrive at a sort of a holistic a view of things that'll work for everybody. Let's just have everybody doing their own experimentation. And so we get a lot of individualism and personal autonomy. We get elitism. We get wealth and power. We get all these absolutized ideologies, right? Like feminism, for all its good things, became crystallized and hardened into something that was not anticipated in the beginning. Genderism, racism, victimhood is a big thing. Tribalism, diversity, inclusion, equality, and so on. All of these things have become their own sort of absolutized ideologies, and so they're not necessarily compatible with each other. It's all very, very fragmented now. There's nothing that's really holding it together. Science is, I guess, the thing that's sort of there as perhaps the best option in most people's minds, or something like that. But we're in a very fragmented worldview kind of situation, I would say, and it's scary. But I think it's full of opportunity too. If we get smart enough as Christians to understand this well enough, and to offer some solutions or possibilities, I think this is what we have to do.
Just recently in the newspaper, they were talking the transgenders fighting against the homosexuals because they have a completely different view of how they can survive and thrive in this world. Yeah. And they're onto each other.
I think that's partly what's going to resolve this thing, that some of these things, as hardened as they are, they're incompatible with other things that are also hardened. And so there's going to be some serious clashes there. And I think we should partly we should stand back and watch it happen, or even encourage it to happen, I would say. And you should ask, well, what about this? These people say that, and you people say this. What about this? And so on, so on, so on. You know, one thing, we'll come back to that a bit. One thing that really strikes me is that postmodernism, POMO as we call it, you know, how many direct threats there are to human life coming out of this, like redefining the human person, redefining family, redefining marriage, redefining gender. You know, the birth rates in most of the developed world are less than replacement. Like, we don't believe in ourselves even anymore. We don't believe in the future of humanity. You know, we've given up a lot when we walked away from the Christian worldview. we really have. And then you've got you know, radical things like abortion, infanticide, medically assisted suicide, and we got tons of violent entertainment too. We glorify violence and so on. So we're pretty screwed up right now, I would say, and there's opportunity there as well. I want to make sure I come back to Jane's thing. Well, let me finish this, and we'll make sure we come back, Jane. I think a way to behave, a way to minister, a way to handle it right now, are to ask these postmoderns, you know, what's your starting assumption? Where are you coming from? Where are you getting this? What makes you think so? And I think we should encourage doubt. You know, usually people want assurance, but if we're going to tackle some of these false narratives, we should raise doubts about what they're saying. I don't think you should just throw your Christian answer at them and hope for the best. You should encourage doubt, I think, and ask, well, how do you know what you think you know? What's your method? Where did you start? What's your opening statement, and how did you get to where you got to, and so on. So I do think you know, we radically need a renewing of Western Christianity. It's needed in all areas, and how to sojourn in our current culture and, you know, help to renew Christianity. That's the biggest single thing, I think. So how to think. We need wisdom, not just knowledge. and not just logic. We need wisdom, especially of the Old Testament variety, which is, see, the Greek wisdom is about what's true. Hebrew wisdom is what to do. Okay? What's true versus what to do. And we need a big dose of Hebrew wisdom these days, I'd say. How to act, that's essentially Hebrew wisdom. And then how to be. Boy, do we need character revision. Again, as you think of the big high-profile evangelists and others who've really made a mess of things over the last 50 years or so, we've forgotten about character, seems, and we really need to push that. So, Jane, just coming back to, I don't want to miss coming back. You were saying, just say that again if you would, please. Faith and
logic, I think she was talking about.
I'm kind of going back. I mean, it's hard to really talk about logic as a believer because our worldview is shaped by scripture. But scripture yet does address the question of logic when we look at, for example, 1 Corinthians 2:9, where it talks about, those without God's Spirit are limited. So when, addressing matters of, for example, someone who is dead raised to life, it's a miracle. And so, you referred to the metaphysical, but for us who have been taken out of the world and are seated with Christ, it's hard to try and reason with someone who is not in that. And I think the conversation becomes even more complex when you have Christian scientists who argue with scripture or try to prove scripture through the scientific method. It's just that faith and logic are two different realms, and so trying to bring them to the same table and make sense out of them is humanly not possible, I think.
well, I wouldn't like to say that faith is not logical, because I think it is. It just depends on what your starting assumption is. Like if you feel a call of God to go somewhere to do some particular thing, then it'd be logical to do this and then to do that and then to do that and so on. So I think if you can think of it in terms of worldview, I think that makes the difference, right? Within a worldview that has God as the only autonomous thing, then everything else can fall into place. But if you don't have that worldview, then you have the kinds of conflicts that we talk about. So within a worldview that has God at the top and makes everything possible, then there's nothing illogical about a resurrection. It's not illogical. Why wouldn't there be? Why couldn't there be? Yeah? Anything's possible. It's not to say it happens all the time, but with God at the top, anything is possible. So resurrection is possible, period. That's how I would go there. And I think when you're talking to people, we should talk in terms of worldview more and more, because that's where the difference is. And I'd like to see a lot more preaching based on worldview, like where are you coming from, and what are your assumptions, and so on, because that's fundamental to everything else, it seems to me. Oh, well, you know what? It's 2 minutes after 10. And we have to stop. Thank you so much. I mean, it's been fun for me. I hope it's been useful for you. I appreciate your conversation. And I would ask you to think along these lines, you know, of worldview, because I think there's some good answers there. There's a good way of responding to people out there. And I do think it's an opportune time for Christians to be smart, and I think we can make progress because so many things are up in the air. You know, people have there's a certain kind of openness. Lots of people are fixated on their particular little thing, but if you can jostle them loose, you know, and ask them what they're, how do they know, or how do they get there, where'd they start, this is all going to help. God bless you. Thank you so much. It's good fun.